Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to be sharing some of my background, which I haven't shared before. I've had this meetup for the past some years, and some people don't know that I started and run this meetup. Other people ask, well, how am I qualified to have such a meetup like this? So just a little bit of background before we go through the introductory slides for this meetup. My real name is Constance Wells. I use JJ on the website because working in corporate America, when they do background checks, they do scrape the internet for your name. And if they don't quite agree with some of the weird woo-woo stuff you do, they may hesitate in regards to you, because if you're dealing with client confidential information and numbers and finances, it's even more so. And that's sort of a rule of thumb when you use your name and you work for corporate America in sensitive positions on the internet. It's just part of the background checks they do these days. But as Constance Wells, what do I do for a living? Well, I build computer systems for corporate IT divisions. I've been doing that my entire career. I started in Silicon Valley as a printed circuit board designer and drafter. One of the departments I managed, I had 30 design drafters reporting to me as we designed the B-52 bomber flight simulator for the Air Force. I was part of a startup company in Silicon Valley where we were designing software, educational software that ran on the first Apple computers. And I've been doing that ever since. I'm vice president of the Society of Information Management, the Denver chapter here. The section of that organization, I'm vice president of the group who brings along new C-level managers into the IT industry. So that's the technical part. Now the woo-woo part is psychics run in my family. My mother, my sisters, it's on my mother's side of the family, not my father's as much. And we have all different types of psychics in my family. My mother just knows stuff. She is claircognizant. Another sister, she is a medium, a natural medium. She would see dead people walking around the house at night as a small child. You can imagine how that terrifies a small child. But that's not unusual in this society. And then it's suppressed. My other sister, she does healing over the phone. She can tell you what's going on with your body and recommend supplements for you that solves those long-standing issues and other issues that are coming up. The psychic ability goes back 5 generations in my family, all the way to the old country. I've had psychic training over the last several years, and I can tell you things about yourself and others. When I lived in Los Angeles, I was voted in as president of the Association of Research and Enlightenment Study Group Council. I had 16 clubs reporting to me. We supported those clubs. We also put on conferences and workshops along the lines of the Edgar Cayce readings. You've heard of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. I have more than 50 years of astrology under my belt. My mother was a professional astrologer. So I can tell you more about yourself, your children, your relatives, about a company, about a country by looking at your astrology. And I can give you the timing of when things are going to occur in your life and your family's life. That's astrology. I can tell you the best places to live in the United States that will make you famous, that will find you the love of your life, especially if you want him to have money. If you want to be a writer, etc., etc. So, I have more than 30 years of tarot card reading. I'm trained in that and rather good at that. So, etc., etc. So I have all that. And I have a conference that I'm planning, 9 speakers in May of 2018. So that's a little bit of background on me. And I love doing this type of meetup, educating people on all of this really paranormal, supernatural things that happen in our lives all the time. And working with people who have had near-death experiences, when we leave this flesh body, we go interdimensionally. We go into another dimension. When we have a spontaneous out-of-body experience, we leave our body. We go into another dimension. And when we are abducted by ETs, we are taken into another dimension. And it's all across these planes of consciousness. All of those look and feel the same. Because I've had speakers here who sat side by side, the ET abductee and the death experiencer. And they say the same thing. They use the same words. Their life changes radically in the same way after they've had the abduction or the death. Because all in all, we are in another dimension. And that's where the ETs dwell. That's where the angels dwell. That's where our guides dwell. So to try to silo these experiences is really shortchanging ourselves. Because we are pan-dimensional, really powerful beings, and we move across all of these dimensions and these consciousnesses. Later, after the meeting, we do meet at Mad Green's, and that's where I will share the CE5 event I attended last night until 1:30 this morning. CE5, what is that? That is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. That's where we take our consciousness and we initiate contact with ETs, UFOs, in that other dimension. And by the way, we had a psychic medium in the group, and they are the best at contacting ETs. They're already used to going to another dimension. That's what they do for a living, and they're quite good at it. Mediums and psychics are some of the best in contacting ETs and angels or our dead loved ones. So I hope you get the consistency of this consciousness and moving into another dimension and what is in that other dimension, the higher vibrations than this flesh material plane. Robert Caplan is a near-death experiencer. And let me clarify that word near-death experience. I've actually talked to people about those who have been killed or murdered and have risen from the dead and have retaken a really crippled, crushed body. And they've been shocked to hear about that, about a near-death experiencer. And I said, well, a near-death isn't really near, because all of us have had near-death experiences, driving around Denver Metro. Huh? But we haven't actually been dead and then risen from the dead. So it's actually a death experience. You did die. You did stop breathing. The heart stopped. The brain stopped. Some near-death experiencers or death experiencers have been dead anywhere from 30 seconds to an hour and a half. An hour and a half where they rose from the dead in the morgue, and they wondered where they were. So it's a real thing. It is a death experience. There's nothing near about it. It is a death experience. So Robert had one of those when he was sucked into the engine of a jet plane sitting on the tarmac. He died. And then he came back. He rose from the dead there on the tarmac as they were giving last rites to him. He'll tell you much more about himself. He's a very accomplished speaker. He has spoken on dozens of radio stations, given interviews. And something else about near-death experiencers is they came back for a reason, and that's why they're interviewed so often on radio stations and YouTube videos and television stations. They came back for a reason. It's hard coming back into this world because you see how wonderful it is on the other side. And frequently, they can hardly wait to go back. That is, they can hardly wait to die again. They're not afraid of death. But they came back here to teach us. They came back here for us, to remind us of what this life really is about. It's a far more spiritual life and a less material life. So Robert, very accomplished, listen to what he has to say, because once they return back here to the flesh body, they do remain connected to the other side. And they always have new information and new reminders for us. And it can be very helpful for us, each one of us, as we move into our future into maybe more troubled times. It is the death experiencers and those who have been to the other side who will help us the most as we move into rough times. So please help me welcome Robert Caplan.
Thank you, JJ. I'm going to give a short bio of my life, my early life, and I'm going to introduce a video which will last for 8 minutes. I took it off TV. It captures the climate and the action of how I was injured. And then after that, I'll talk about the after effects of being out of my body and other things that I'll add that are relevant to being here in this life as I present it. I might add something to what JJ said. I am very convinced that there is nobody like any one of us, which means that when we talk about this subject or any subject, we're always talking subjectively. Even the scientists cannot escape the original way they see, they speak, they act, and they have their own inner experience that they project out. And that's important to me. So let me just simply say, as a child, I was born in 1937, and last April I turned 80. And about 10 months after I was born, I was placed in an orphanage because my parents were divorcing. And my mother had to work. And even though I had relatives that I stayed with as an infant, it was a burden on my mother facing the judgment of the relatives. And anybody that got divorced back in those days was a pariah. So from the orphanage, I went to let me just simply say, my parents were Jewish. My mother came from a Reformed tradition, my father from an Orthodox. And the orphanage that I was in was Christian. I was there for about a year, and then I was placed in a Baptist children's home. From there, I went to a foster home, which was Catholic. When I was 6 years old, I went home to live with my mother for 4 years. And during that 4 years, I attended public school, but I did so poorly. I couldn't read, I couldn't recite, I was very, very withdrawn, and my mother decided that she had to take me out of public school and put me in a Catholic boarding school for 2 years. So I've had 5 boarding schools. And to me, are there any military here? Former? Current? Former, yeah. Well, to me, the military was another boarding school. You got a uniform, you got food, you got regimen, you got authority, meaning you had to obey authority. But I was very well suited to fit into that structure. So when I was 18, I joined the reserves. I was in junior college, first year, and they were starting to draft students, mainly men, because Korea had ended and the military was losing all kinds of personnel. They had to keep a minimum, so they were drafting college students. The only way you could avoid being drafted was to be in the reserves. So I joined the reserves, and the guarantee was that if I finished school, I would immediately go on active duty after I got my degree. It turned out that they were desperate for men. After 1 year, they drafted me. I could have contested it, but frankly, I didn't even like college. It was more of the same of high school, and I wasn't really emotionally suited for the classroom. So I went on active duty at the age of 19 and a half. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a video of my job. I served on the largest ship in the world at the time, the U.S.S. Forrestal. It's 3 football fields long, 12 stories high above the water, and about 13 below the water. So it's a huge thing. I never saw the whole ship. It was way too complicated, and you had to have permission, and it was like a huge city to me. Anyway, in this video that I'm going to show you, it's going to describe the job that I had, which was called plane captain. I was the fellow that helped the pilot pre-flight the aircraft, strapped in his parachute, and did a whole bunch of procedures to get the plane ready for being catapulted off the deck. So it was a very meticulous job with very little deviation. And the reason for that is when we were on maneuvers, there were as many as 30 planes revving up all at the same time. My original purpose for wanting an audio thing was strictly to get the sound. The sound was so intense you could not hear a thing. So everything was hand signals. And you have planes all around you. And you have to be very, very conscious of mistakes and movement and what have you. So in the video, there's going to be a young man who is a plane captain, and he's talking about his relationship to the plane, to the pilot, and his job. The thing that I want to make clear is it's not the same plane that I had. My plane was in 1957. This plane was probably in the 80s. So it's a more modern single-engine plane. Actually, it's not quite single, it's 2 engines, but it's not the same plane. That's important. So with that, let's watch the video. It's only 8 minutes, and I want you to be particularly focused on the very first word that's going to be on the screen. That word is related to much of what JJ was talking about. It's a very common word. I went on to study psychology. This word was not mentioned very much at all. It's the very first word on the screen, and I want you to recognize your own familiar experience of that word.